looking for monkey on a bicycle. All right, so just a couple of things. I think I've graded everybody's first 2 questions from Unit 1 and hope to finish up question 3 by Friday. Goodness, that's been a really slow process. Made me think that I really want you to turn in a question each week so I don't get them all at once and have 300 things to grade. But I don't know. We'll try it one more time and then see what you think. My guess is you're content with this. The only problem on my end is that it just takes forever to grade 300 things, and I'm sorry about that. The quiz review timed question thing should be up. Hopefully you're able to find that. And that's still a couple weeks away, so no rush on that. Don't be distressed at this moment. Your weekly question is about involvement in World War I, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. One thing that I'm noticing fairly consistently, most of your answers to the weekly questions are fine. One thing that I would suggest is make sure you put dates in them. So if you're talking about events, now that, like for your weekly question this week, involvement of different ethnic groups in World War I, you may not need dates for that. But if you put a specific event, I would put a date because it'll help remind you to put them in order as well. Like some of you on the Native American question, which is the one I just spent a lot of time grading, you would answer about stuff that happened at Wounded Knee, and then you would go back and talk about Custer's Last Stand, and then you would talk about the Dawes Act, and that mostly gave me a headache because it's out of order. And the reason that chronology matters in history is it usually shows cause and effect. So, you know, it doesn't make sense for you to talk about the end of organized resistance. I don't know what makes someone a criminal. It doesn't make sense to talk about the end of organized resistance to Native America by Native Americans and then talk about Custer's Last Stand. And all those things sort of led up to something. You know, Custer's Last Stand may have sent a message to the US government that we've got to be more stringent with Native Americans because they have the ability to beat our troops. And then that may be part of the reason they subdivided them at the Dawes Act. And that may be part of the reason they put down the ghost stance, even though it clearly was not an armed rebellion, because they didn't want it to turn into something. And again, I'm not suggesting that justifies any of those actions, but if you put that stuff in order, it may show you a more logical cause and effect sequence. And that stuff really matters in history. Typically it matters a lot in history. And it'll make more sense to you. And I'll think that you paid more attention as well. Also, details from the book, always add those, not just stuff I say in the lecture or things you got from Wikipedia. Although most of you are not Wikipedia people. I appreciate that. At least on my assignments. I do appreciate that. I'm not necessarily opposed to Wikipedia. I do think it serves a purpose. Of course it serves a purpose, but sometimes it's not accurate. Might be a good place to start, and then you could scroll down and look for sources. But for our work, most of your answers should come from the book. The only time you're not using the book is your book review, and then you're using another book. Also, you had a question about, a book for the book review, and I didn't answer it, sorry. I emailed somebody yesterday that I hadn't emailed for a while. So sometimes this get kind of nested in there and I don't see them. So I apologize for ignoring your emails. All right, I know you're past ready. You are ready to talk about the stuff for today. So let's remind ourselves of the weekly questions, see if I have that handy. No, that's not cool, but I'll share the notes. And I'll read the weekly question to you. Although you're aware of it, I know you know. Explain the reasons for and describe U.S. participation in World War I. Describe how World War I transformed the roles of women, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. All right, I was talking about the 20s in the next class. All right, and again, your 20s lecture, I'll pre-record that probably on Sunday and post it. If I get super tired, I might just use an old, nah, I won't get tired. No, that'll be after surgery where we get tired. So, all right, but look for a lecture about that, or you might watch the previous class, which I might post before I run off to the doctor. We'll see. All right, so World War I, why did we get involved, and how did it change the roles of people, maybe even the government? I don't know. You could talk about these things. One thing also, when you're answering the weekly question, make sure you answer at least everything I've asked about. You know, you can add more stuff, and sometimes you probably will want to, but don't leave out anything I ask about. You know, if I said, talk about women, African Americans, and Hispanics, mention those. Your book is super, super specific about those, so it should be easy to find. And part of my goal here, it's two goals really, is to have you pay a little more attention to the specifics of the chapter and also get you a little bit more in depth than we do in the lecture. So I'm really hoping this will cause you to read at least part of the textbook to answer these questions. All right, so why did the US get involved in World War I? When you answer this, if you don't talk about the Zimmerman note, that's not going to go well. You have to talk about the Zimmerman note. Now, you can talk about the Lusitania, you can talk about other ships that got sunk. That's all cool. But you have to talk about the Zimmerman note. And don't just say the Zimmerman note. Say, you know, that it proposed an alliance between the United States and between Germany and Mexico. And then you can talk about it a little more specifically if you like, but definitely mention it. And I would mention that the Germans were sinking ships, US cargo and passenger ships and military ships in the Atlantic, and that was an irritant to us. All right, so there you go, Zimmerman note. Don't forget to talk about the Zimmerman note. It's really important. All right, and the reason I talked about the Mexican Revolution at some length last time was to let you know that it's not complete craziness to think that Mexico is upset with the United States during this time period, because we've maybe invaded them a few times and taken over a port city or two because we think we can keep it more safe for trade than they can. So yeah, they're irritated with us. So it's not completely out of bounds or impossible that they might want to consider that proposal that Germany made. All right. And then you could also, when you answer this question, talk about the 14-point speech, because this is what Wilson says is the reason that we enter the war. And there's apparently 14 reasons. And because we're in the progressive era, our thought is, you know, we want to share the progress we are making with the United States with the entire world. So this will give us that opportunity to do that. So we can spread progressivism throughout the world in a variety of ways, perhaps 14, including making sure that the seas are safe for commerce and travel, making sure that countries get to determine who lives there, which, you know, is kind of a weird concept in the modern era, but made more sense to them then. So free trade, which kind of has to do with freedom of the seas. So the free trade and freedom of the seas do kind of go together, but freedom of the seas, the idea that if you're a non-combatant nation, if there are some countries that are having a conflict of some sort, that if you're not involved in that, they don't have the involved in that officially. They don't have the right to sink your ships. That was, you know, we were concerned about that. Open diplomacy, treaties without secret clauses, and creation of a peacekeeping organization to prevent future world wars, which becomes the League of Nations. So, and there are more points in there, but yeah, there you go. And your book talks about those. I think we talked about some of this stuff last time, so I don't want to go over the whole thing, although I'd started to in the last class and they told me to stop. Like, well, see how it is. See how it is. When you're talking about the different ethnic groups, and the book has little sections where it says African American, and it says something like divided. It has divisions of, I think it was Puerto Rican, Mexican, but the book is super specific about this, so it'll be easy to find this stuff when you do the weekly question. But do notice that lots of people are going to immigrate through the Mexican border during this time period because we're really ramping up production of all kinds of stuff, including agricultural products. So there are going to be lots of people who immigrate to the Rio Grande Valley section of Texas where we grow lots of food, and to the section of California where they grow lots of food as well, San Fernando Valley. So the valleys where you grow food. But also manufacturing in the, not as much in the South, but more in the North, which is why you see African Americans in fairly large numbers move from the South to the North for defense industry jobs. You will also see women enter the workforce in larger numbers. One thing I would caution you against as you answer this question, the weekly question, is to not go overboard on your conclusions or your statement at the beginning. You know, you don't want to say women dominated the workforce or this leads to women staying permanently in the workforce, because it doesn't. Neither of those things are exactly true. Women will stay in the workforce until men come back from the war for World War I. In World War II, you see a much more permanent change because we're involved in World War II much longer. And then the aftermath of World War II keeps us involved in international affairs. So in a weird way, it creates a whole new industry. The defense industry becomes much bigger, and there'll be more women involved in, well, there's also the GI Bill. So after World War II, men will go to college because they get free college, and some women, but it's primarily men, will go to college, and women will stay in the workforce to support the family while they finish their college degree. Oh, I heard my. All right. So don't go overboard and say women dominated the workforce and they would never leave again. The expectation was when men came home from the war effort that men would retain the jobs and women would go back to raising the kids. So the thought was we'd be conservative once again. And we kind of were, and then the young women, not as much because we have the little flapper, or the big flapper generation, which we'll talk about later. And when you mention African Americans and this early migration or diaspora during this time period, you feel free to talk about where they moved, what kind of jobs they had, and how they were received. Because I know we've said this more than once. Our assumption is that in the North there are no race issues, and in the South that's where they all are. If there's people of different races, there's probably race issues, for better or worse, clearly. That seems to be the way human nature works. Not suggesting we're all that way, but enough of us are that it's a consistent problem throughout history. So yeah, the new folks or people who are different often get harassed. And what else do we want to say? Oh, we wanted to talk a little about Marcus Garvey, although I don't know that he fits in super well with our discussion of the weekly question, although he kind of does. What do we want to say about the weekly question? Oh, you should feel free to mention in your answer to the weekly question, you know, how do we participate in the war effort? You can talk about patriotism and you could talk about a repression of free speech if you like. Now, somebody in the last class said, you know, one of the hardest things about these questions is keeping the answer short enough. And I could see that as a problem on this one, but that's not a problem most of you are having. A couple of you maybe, most of you are not having that problem. So, you know, feel free to add in stuff about free speech if you like and patriotism, but Oh, sorry for the yawn. Don't feel compelled, but if you want something else to say. All right. As far as reasons we get involved, we've already talked about the Zimmerman note, but you might also talk about general involvement like food relief efforts, bond sales, propaganda campaigns, that sort of stuff, where we have that big anti-German push during this era. So if you want to talk about cultural change in there, you can, as part of the description of U.S. participation in World War I. I don't know if that all makes sense. Hopefully it does a little. And then, all right. I think that's it for those sorts of things. And then immigration restrictions, that really happens. You've probably noticed when there's a war going on, people tend to not immigrate, overseas, especially if it's, it affects the mode of transportation that would take you overseas. So there's not a lot of immigration other than Mexican immigration during World War I. After World War I is when we'll start to add immigration restrictions. And we'll mostly restrict everyone, pretty much everyone. We've already restricted Asians, and we'll restrict pretty much the rest of Europe during this time period. So the only acceptable immigration during and after World War I will be Mexican, and we'll be completely fine with that, and there'll be lots of it. And you see that change really when the economy changes, and that's kind of the trend that you'll see in U.S. history, in U.S. history with Mexican immigration. When the economy's good, we're in favor of it. When the economy is bad, we're less in favor of it. That's consistent. Other stuff. Marcus Garvey. Let's talk about Marcus Garvey for a few minutes. So your book talks a little about Marcus Garvey, and I feel like, I'm going to peek in there, but I feel like they give you pictures. Let me peek. Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is an interesting fellow. He was an immigrant to the United States. I feel like he was from Jamaica, pretty sure that he was. And he's going to lead a movement, there it is, Rise of Garveyism, page 767. Looking to see if they have a photo. Darn it, they didn't put a photo in there. And he definitely was from Jamaica. And he thought that for African Americans to have success in the United States, it's not necessarily integration that they needed, but they needed to have pride in their heritage and also economic independence. So he is going to push for Pan-Africanism, kind of an early Black is beautiful sort of guy. He's quirky in some ways. They have parades a lot. He lives in the Harlem area of neighborhood of New York. They have parades a lot, and he'll dress sort of like a drum major kind of person sometimes, or sometimes he has hats that look like military hats. He's an interesting fellow, but he's going to push the idea that all of civilization began in Africa. People with African heritage should have enormous pride in that, and that within the United States, what African Americans need to do is build up the African American community economically. You'll see W.E.B. Du Bois push something like that as far as economics, but Du Bois is, he's your Harvard version of let's push for African American rights, and Marcus Garvey is the not formally educated version. So he's interesting, but very successful and very persuasive as well, and certainly has a big following. Probably the most important person for us historically that follows him is Malcolm X's father, Malcolm Little, and that'll have some influence on Malcolm X. But what happens to Marcus Garvey, he's going to start a company called the Black Star Cruise Line. And what it will do is lead, they have cruise ships and they have tours, vacations, cruises to different nations in Africa so that people from the United States can go back to places, or not back to, but to places in Africa to explore their heritage. As a rule, most of the African Americans in the United States had not recently immigrated, as most of us know. Certainly, whether you're from a Caribbean island or South America or North America and African American, lots and lots of people of African American heritage came over as slaves. So part of the push here and part of the discussion is that your heritage was stolen from you, so it's a chance for you to reconnect with the great heritage that you had from Africa. So going back and forth, Pan-Africanism. What eventually happens to Marcus Garvey is he gets charged with, arrested and convicted of embezzlement, of stealing money from the cruise line that he started, and for some tax evasion kind of things, which may or may not have been super accurate. And we'll talk more when we talk about the 20s, maybe on Thursday. We'll talk a little more about what kind of stuff the government was up to in the 20s that seemed a little sketchy. Because I know, we all have different experiences with government, law enforcement, that kind of stuff. And it kind of depends on your background, where you're from, what side of town you're from, who you are, how much trust you have in those institutions. So, I've had people, when we start to study the 20s, like, how can you say that the government wasn't trustworthy and they did things they weren't supposed to do? Your book is going to talk about documented times in the teens and 20s, and it does in this chapter, where the government decides that if you are in an institution, a mental health institution or a prison institution, that it's okay to sterilize you. And that's going to be constitutionally protected during this time period. Your government's up to some unusual stuff during this time period. They're going to convict a couple of immigrants of a murder that they know they didn't commit because they don't like those immigrants' political views. So we're going to see some documented situations. And this Espionage and Sedition Act, most of us are going to think that's a little excessive during the time period where you can convict somebody and deport them because they opposed the war effort or said something bad about the US government. It seems extreme, and the government might collude from time to time. I mean, there's lots of suggestions / evidence that happened to the Knights of Labor at the Haymarket Square bombing and aftermath. So, from time to time, our government will do some things that maybe aren't trustworthy or on the up and up. So I think it's possible. I haven't studied Garvey to great extent, but I've seen, decent scholarship suggesting, very reputable sources suggesting that Garvey was unfairly prosecuted. And I could see that happening. He was very popular. He definitely pushed African Americans to demand certain rights and protections or to take them on themselves. And it wasn't always, well, that would be the understatement of the day. It wasn't always well received. Understatement of the day. All right. What else do we want to say about this era? Okay. So as the war ends, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations are created. So the US has to decide, are we going to get involved in the League of Nations? Now, I don't know, government is a little complicated. I don't know if you're in a government class right now, but it's not as straightforward as it might seem. So what happens when there's a treaty, like Treaty of Versailles? Woodrow Wilson actually negotiated the treaty and wrote most of it. So he writes it, signs it, gets the European nations to sign it. Germany agrees to a big war debt, a whole bunch of stuff. We'll talk about that later because that's going to set up World War II. But the Treaty of Versailles is created by Woodrow Wilson, and he's going to sign it for the United States. Then he has to come back to the United States and persuade the Senate to ratify it. So the Senate gets to ratify treaties. They also get to approve Supreme Court justices, which you're about to see, which is going to be a fast thing. Oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, didn't I? But when Wilson brings the treaty back to the Senate says, hey, we're glad you wrote this, and I know you're excited about it, but I don't think we want to sign it. Well, this upsets Wilson because he wrote it and he was seen as kind of the hero of the Treaty of Versailles. So he didn't understand why they would oppose anything that he did, because he's Wilson. It has to be great. So he could either sit down and negotiate with them and kind of persuade them, like, this is why you should sign the treaty, or he could, I don't know, threaten them a little. And that's what he chooses to do. He says, hey, senators, take it or leave it. I'm not going to change anything about it. And if you don't vote to ratify my treaty, I will go to your home district and I will campaign against you. Can you believe it? Can you believe a president would be argumentative and confrontational? It's shocking. It's never happened in history before. Okay, it happens all the time, doesn't it? So Woodrow Wilson was frustrated. And rather than negotiate with people in the Senate who thought that there were changes that needed to be made to the treaty, and there's changes, like the most famous ones are called the Lodge reservations, because a fellow named Henry Cabot Lodge was the leader of the delegation who opposed the treaty for those reasons. Those reasons were, because those are probably the most prominent ones, because they had like strong reservationists. Those were guys like, I really doubt that you could make a treaty that we would approve of. So there's very little chance they would approve of it. And then mild reservationists, and then these people called who had the lodge reservations, which didn't mean they were going to stay at a lodge. It meant that they agreed with Henry Cabot Lodge. What his concern about the Treaty of Versailles was about the multinational military force that was created by the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles said, you know, if you have a dispute, you can come together, we can talk about it, we can adjudicate it, we might boycott you, we might stop sending whatever we sell to you, steel or wheat or whatever we sell to you, so we could isolate you economically. Or we could have this military force and we could send them to put you down, like to suppress your rebellion or whatever's going on. So for them to have a multinational military force, that would mean that all the nations would have to contribute to it. Well, the United States was not cool with that. The US did not want to contribute to the military force. Here are some reasons. Reason number one, in our Constitution, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, not the guy who's the head of the League of Nations. So we don't want the League of Nations being in charge of any part of our military. That made us nervous. Thing number two, Congress has the power to declare war. So the Congress didn't want to give away that power to some multinational military group that was led by people who may not have the best interest of the United States in mind. So let's say that the League of Nations decides that what the United States is doing is bad. Like maybe it's not cool for the US to send troops into Veracruz and take over that port city. Maybe then the League of Nations would send troops to push the US troops out. So then we would have US troops fighting against US troops. And, you know, except for the Civil War, we can't have that. And we probably didn't really want the Civil War, but there it was. So we definitely did not want to put our troops under the control of someone else. And that honestly probably makes pretty good sense to most of you. So the Senate asked Woodrow Wilson, is there a way that you can negotiate and change the logistics of how that works so that it's not, you know, somebody outside of US control that gets the opportunity to send our troops somewhere. And Woodrow Wilson said no. He said no. Now, why did Woodrow Wilson say no? Maybe a couple of reasons. Maybe because he's Woodrow Wilson and he's always right. And he'd been in all those jobs that we mentioned before where people don't question your authority or your judgment. And, you know, you just don't appreciate alternate opinions. That can happen. Maybe it's because Woodrow Wilson, you know, came home with all these accolades from negotiating this treaty, and he was very well received and highly regarded and didn't want to come home and be questioned. Could be that. Could also be because in the modern era, people think he probably had a minor stroke while he was over negotiating this treaty. Now, if you, sometimes people who have had strokes, major or minor, it alters their personality, it alters their temperament, that sort of thing. I have a friend who had a stroke, and it's just absolutely the strangest thing. And I don't think it's just because she had a near-death experience. But she, before the stroke, was pretty much an atheist. And after the stroke, she's at church like 5 times a week. And it's great. I mean, I like church, so I'm not saying anything. But it's such a dramatic difference in who she was. And she doesn't even really remember, you know, what she was like before. So the stroke really kind of changed her personality. It's not just that it was a near-death experience. Now, with this instance, it didn't dramatically change Wilson's personality. He was like that before, but some people argue that it enhanced that part of his personality. I have no idea. But thing number 3, whether he was willing to negotiate or not, when he got back to the United States, he did have a major stroke. And then after that, he was unable to communicate and he was unable to walk. So he was not going to be able to persuade the Senate after that to ratify his treaty because he was just physically unable to. So they end up not approving the treaty, and we don't join the League of Nations. And a few other large countries don't join the League of Nations, and that ends up being a problem as well. Sorry, I got distracted by an animal on my back porch. Apologies. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, disabled a little bit by the stroke. He does recover some to the point where he's able to walk and talk and address the press, that sort of thing, be seen in public. But for about 4 or 5 months, Woodrow Wilson's kind of MIA. Now, your book will also talk about Woodrow Wilson and his wife potentially running the country while he was in this state. And if you're wondering, how could a president kind of be MIA for 4 or 5 months? I'm wondering that as well. Or maybe it's because, you know, it's a different time and the press was different. We didn't have TV news, so we didn't see the president every day. They didn't have radio show. I mean, they had radio shows, but the president wasn't on them very often. And this president definitely wasn't on them. He didn't give, you know, like a weekly press interview, or he didn't have a weekly press conference. He didn't take questions on a regular basis. So they were a little isolated from the press. And again, when you did see the president, it was on newsreel, so at the movies, and that wasn't a regular thing either. And there wasn't an expectation that you saw the president with regularity. So one, he's not in the public eye unless he wants to be, like Teddy Roosevelt was a lot because he wanted to be, but Woodrow Wilson, not as much. Another thing, we did not have a succession amendment then, so we hadn't really decided who was going to take over if something happened to the president. Now, we'd certainly already had instances where the president was killed, and the assumption was the vice president would take over. But we didn't have any procedure, what we would do if the president was impaired or disabled. and was temporarily unable to be in charge. So their thought was the way we'll deal with this is we'll conceal it. So they hid it. And if you wanted to see the president in those 4 or 5 months, the only way you had access to the president was through his personal doctor or through his wife. And neither of them were going to let you see the president. So when we had legislation that needed to be signed, or if they had papers they wanted to get to the president, one of those two people took them in. And if the president signed a bill or signed a declaration, people did notice that his signature was different. And people attributed that to him being sick, to him having the stroke. And it certainly can change your handwriting, for sure. So they thought that was just a legitimate excuse. But the only people that had access were the doctor and the wife. And your book has that little section where it talks about how Woodrow Wilson's wife probably ran the country for a few months, which is moderately interesting, maybe. So we've kind of unofficially had a female president, maybe, I don't know. But only briefly. And yeah, nothing of great consequence happened, legislatively during that time period, but I'm not saying that means it's okay for the president to conceal that he's unable to govern the country. I'm going to go with no on that. We passed an amendment that says who takes over after FDR. So, well, actually, it's way after FDR. It's after JFK. We wait a long time to do that. Yeah, we do. Kind of a weird thing. Good stuff. All right. Other stuff we need to talk about. Let's see, we talked about Wilson, Versailles, League of Nations. We don't join. Okay. So then the book kind of quickly goes into quick talk about the 1920s, the beginning of the 1920s. Wilson actually thinks about running for a third term, which is weird because he's not well, and then decides against it. And you have Warren Harding, who gets selected, and we elect him, who knows why? I mean, because he gets the most votes, of course, but there's nothing unusually appealing about him. He seems like, your stereotypical politician. He's well connected, he's decent amount of money, but people will say he looks presidential. But his platform really is a return to normalcy. He makes up a word, normalcy. And it's a push away from this era of sacrifice and let's work hard for the war effort and be okay with being drafted and let's eat less so we can send more food overseas, that sort of thing. And let's continually try to reform stuff and make stuff better. Maybe we're just tired of all that at this point. And that is kind of what is going on during this era. We're sort of tired of reform and sacrifice, which your book and other people as well will refer to as Wilsonism, making the world safe for democracy and sending troops to Mexico to try to fix them. And like, let's stop trying to fix everybody and let's just take care of ourselves. So the 20s is kind of a take care of ourselves decade. And some of that you'll be entertained by and you go like, that's good. And some of it you'll look at and you go like, what the heck were we thinking? And there's lots of both during that time period. What you see in the 20s really is a push away from immigration in a really big way. So we're going to restrict pretty much all immigrants except Mexicans. What you'll also see is a push toward popular culture in some ways. So, music and dancing and games and movies and baseball and horse racing. So we're going to have a lot of fun in the 20s. At the same time that alcohol is illegal, although people are clearly still using it. So that also kind of breeds a contempt for following the law. It becomes sort of trendy to break the law. We're going to really dislike communists and anarchists during this time period. And you'll see the rise of the KKK, which is really sort of a strange thing to happen when it did. All right, I'm going to pause the sharing there for a minute and see if you guys have any questions to this point. Is there anything you want to talk about related to the weekly question, to World War I? Knowing, of course, that you can find lots of stuff for the weekly question in your textbook, chapter 19. Okay, this also gives me a chance to make sure you're paying attention. Are you paying attention? Do you have any questions? Is there anything I need to know? Can I unmute those of you that were, I muted a couple of you, sorry. I was hearing weird things. But type a question if you have one. I'm gonna wait a minute just to see. And then we will talk a little bit about the 20s. I don't want to talk about it too much, but you know, for those of you that came a little late, you won't have to log into class next time because I won't be available at noon. However, I will make sure that something is posted, either a lecture about the 1920s, or you can watch the class right before, which might be entertaining, but might not be terribly efficient. We'll see. All right, I'm looking in the chat, sorry. Oh yeah, amendments. Yeah. Okay. So amendments in the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles kind of continued as is. We just didn't join the League of Nations, and several other large nations didn't join the League of Nations, so it really didn't have the power it needed to enforce any rulings that they made. So they would make suggestions, essentially, which no one would follow because England, France, Germany, and of course Germany gets punished really harshly by the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll talk about when we talk about the World War II chapter. But they're assessed, what is it, $33 billion in war debt? I don't know why I can't remember the number. Which they can't pay. I mean, they just can't pay. Plus, the treaty loans or takes away some of their more productive regions of their country. So Germany's assessed all of the war guilt and the war debt, the reparations, and they can't afford to pay them. So their economy collapses, and it's one of the many causes of a global depression. So it turns out to be a problem. The League is definitely a predecessor to NATO. Only pretty much everybody joins NATO. So NATO works better. I know some of you are going like, no, it doesn't. It definitely works better than the League of Nations, which didn't work at all. And NATO at times does some effective things. At other times, you might argue that they don't. So Treaty of Versailles did continue, but much of it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, including the League of Nations and Germany paying off reparations, although something like 5 or 6 years ago, they've made their last payment because the US will refinance their reparations because, I don't know, we have banks and stuff, because we'll do it. It's another Dawes Act, which is moderately interesting. All right, 17th Amendment. So the amendments, I know I put this in the study this for the time. Excuse me, sorry. Pardon me. Amendments. So 16, income tax creates income tax. We never had that before, and that ends up being paid by about 10% of people. So income tax. 17, direct election of senators. So rather than your state picking the senator, either the governor would pick the senator or your state legislature would pick them. Now you got to directly vote for your senator. So that's the 17th Amendment. And the thought is, if you directly vote, then more people will be involved in the democratic process and they'll be more engaged. So it'll be better for everyone. And you'll have a better representative because you elected them. So there you go. And the Senate's the one where you get 2 per state. So you guys have any idea? This is where I get to ask a question, because see if you're with me. Do you have any idea who our senators are from Texas? The dudes we send? I know that you do. Some of you are like, I can't even believe she's asking this, but I bet a couple of you do. Senators from Texas who go to DC. One of them's running right now, so you may see commercials. And the other one, your president, yes, your president mentioned for potential Supreme Court nominee, Ted Cruz. The interesting thought, Ted Cruz on the Supreme Court. Now, he was Attorney General for the state of Texas, or I think he was Attorney General. John Cornyn was as well. Oh my goodness, not the Zodiac killer. I think that was his father, right? John Cornyn is the other senator. He's he's kind of an older guy, but not nearly as old, not old enough to run for president, apparently. Because you got to be close to 80 for that. But the commercial I've seen for him lately is about, he pushed for a law that got rid of the backlog on testing rape kits. He's kind of your middle of the road Republican. Well, for Texas, he's probably, yeah, middle of the road. For the rest of the country, he's probably liberal. He's running against MJ Hagar, she got commendations in the Iraq War. She was a helicopter pilot, I think. So that's interesting. But I think this attempt to get us more involved in the electoral process probably wasn't terribly successful, but that's definitely a push in the progressive era. I think immediately more people got involved, and then it was not as trendy anymore. Ted Cruz, Zodiac killer, that's rough. Okay, the other amendments, so that was 17, direct election of senators. 18, prohibition, so it makes alcohol illegal, and 19 gives women the right to vote. And the alcohol illegal thing, that is sale, manufactured, distribution. There you go. And that one's going to be the one they have the most trouble enforcing. And we'll talk a lot about that in the next chapter or two, a lot. And Tuesday, yeah, I am out Tuesday. I'm having surgery on Monday, and I have a follow-up during your class on Tuesday. So that's why I'm saying that the video from the class right before yours could be entertaining, or it could be terrible. I don't know which is why you may want to watch the pre-recorded lecture, which I'm not going to get to do until probably Sunday. All right, so those are the amendments, and League of Nations is kind of the predecessor of NATO, and the Treaty of Versailles did continue without us. It's hard to imagine things could continue without us, as important as we are. All right, any other questions before we kind of go on to a little preview of the 1920s? Not a big one, but a little preview of the 1920s. Also, I'm peeking to see when class ends. We still have so much time. We're good. Okay. Back to the lecture then, I think. We will share the screen. Did I share the screen already? No, I did not share the screen. There it is. Share it again. All right. So the 20s. I don't want to go over all the stuff because, you know, we have to have something to do next week. But if you look at all of U.S. history, like you look at it in a big chunk, or at least the modern part of it, late 1800s to the present, it seems like we go through time periods where we want to be like, we're all about reform, let's make things better, and then we go like, what the heck, let's have a party. And it seems to kind of go back and forth. And there are times we're in the middle. There are times that there are really, you know, divisions between different groups in the United States. There are times that we're all sort of unified about certain things. Sometimes those, oh, sorry. Sometimes those times are really good and very productive. Sometimes those times are not as good. I think that the 20s is kind of a combination of stuff. So in the 20s, we were reacting to this era where we wanted all this reform, the progressive era, and then we had to do all this sacrifice for World War I. So then we go like, hey, we're done with that foolishness. Now it's time to have a good time. I know, they made alcohol illegal, but you still can find it. But what we do is we push away from reform during this time period, and we push away from regulating business. And it's just like, you know what? Money is great. The more of it we make, the better off we'll all be. So rising tide floats all boats kind of idea, trickle down economics, early version perhaps. So let's just not regulate the economy. The government and the economy, big business can work together. It will make everything better for the entire country, because if big businessmen make more money, then they will hire more people, and those people will make more money. And if we regulate stuff, it just kind of slows it down. So government and business were partners during this time period. So an interesting time period. It's going to be really productive in some ways. It's like a mini version of the Gilded Age. It is kind of like a mini version of Gilded Age. However, we've already put in place some workplace safety. Now, we're not going to get rid of child labor. We're not going to go crazy during this time period. But we're also not going to say, you know what, it's cool if people get killed at work again. We're not going back on that. So we're going to keep some of the safety regulations, but we're not going to get rid of child labor. We're not going to put into place minimum wage, that kind of stuff. We'll let the market dictate that. Now, economically, parts of the 20s are pretty good. Clearly, parts of them are pretty bad, because you know what happens in the 1930s. So you'll see a big expansion of the automobile industry during this time period. And one of the things that I think is moderately interesting in chapter 20 is the book talks about why General Motors becomes a more important company than Ford during this time period. And I don't know about people who are much younger than me, if they feel this way, but my brothers, I don't know what's up with them. I have 3 brothers, and they argue a lot about which car manufacturer is better, and they have particular argument between Ford and Chevrolet or General Motors. And I think this is the era. My brothers aren't that old. I'm not saying they started arguing back in the 20s. My parents weren't even born till the 40s. So, but I think this is the era where that argument begins. Do you want, Ford that's done it kind of the same way forever and ever and produces a really high quality product without as many variations? Or do you want to get to pick and choose? And do you want more models and more choice? And that was more of the General Motors thing. I have no idea if that's still the way it is, because I don't have a Ford or a GM, and just, whatever is cheap, that's what I have. So there you go. Although, yeah, no, we'll just stop at that, because nobody wants to talk about cars. This is the time period where, the weirdest thing about the 20s is that the KKK is really popular. I mean, that's way beyond weird, but they're going to brand themselves as really pro-American, pro 100% American, and they're in favor of prohibition because crazy immigrants who bring all kinds of bad things to the United States, drink too much, don't take care of their families. So the KKK is supposed to be like all American and pro-family and that kind of stuff. And they're really going to expand who they harass, being the mildest version of what they do. So they're going to be anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-anybody who's not anti those things. And they're going to have large numbers and lots of political power. And that's going to continue through the 1950s and maybe into the 60s. So this is part of the reason in the modern era, you you younger folks, which is pretty much all of you, yeah. You know, you didn't really live in an era where the KKK was of any importance. I mean, on the political scene, I can remember, crud, back in the 1980s, there was a guy named David Duke who ran for, it was either Senate or governor in Louisiana, and he wins, and then it comes out that he had been a really important member of the KKK back in the day, and then you know things kind of go on the decline for him as they should. Yeah, that's pretty weird stuff. But the KKK in this era, the 20s, is so powerful that they almost persuade, or persuade's not the right word, force a political party to pick a candidate for president who is a KKK member and a really big leader in the KKK. So, and they have, you know, very open parades during this time period. And when you run for office, you list that you're you're part of a KKK affiliate, especially in the Midwest and the South, and it helps you get elected. So it's a really weird time when the KKK is incredibly prominent. Now, you know, again, I'm not suggesting that there are clearly still racial issues that we've got to fix. This is a whole different level. This is a whole different overt level. We'll just go with that because I know we're not all going to agree on this sort of stuff. But, you know, to have the Grand Wizard of the KKK almost get the nomination for your party for president, there's no way that would happen in the modern era. And again, I know that we're all going to have different political views, but that's just really weird. We're anti-immigrant during this time period, as I mentioned, and the Sacco and Vanzetti trial will really point that out. You could read a book about that. That would be interesting. But these guys are anarchists, and they don't like, especially one of them, I think it's Sacco. I always get the two confused. But one of them is much more involved politically. They're going to get convicted of a crime they most likely did not commit. There'll be lots of evidence to suggest that they should get a new trial, and we're not going to do it because we really just don't like who they are, so we execute them. There's also going to be another trial that's moderately interesting where no one dies, called the Scopes Monkey Trial during this time period, and it's about evolution. And this will be an era where we really argue about modern views, maybe science versus older, more traditional views, religion, that sort of stuff. So you see a big argument between old and new, between young and old, between urban and rural. So you'll see a cultural conflict that's pretty strong during this era, you know, to the point where one of the newspaper media reporters at the Scopes Monkey trial, the one about evolution being, is it legal to teach evolution in school? The one reporter will declare that conservative religion, or what he'll call fundamentalism, Bible-believing religion, is dead in the United States because of how the case turns, not necessarily how the case turns out, but how the people arguing the case are portrayed. And of course, you know, you live in this part of the country, so you know that that's he was wrong. That's not true at all. As far as industry goes, anything related to the car industry is going well. Anything related to the farm industry is going to be on the decline. Farmers are going to have great success during World War I because they're going to sell to food, or they're going to sell their food overseas. But once the war is over, they're not going to have nearly as much success. And I don't want to get into too many more details because, you know, we got to save something for next time, because I don't want you to think, you know, it's not important to look at the video next time. I know we're not having class, but to at least look at the recording about the 1920s. But make sure that you check into that. So reform is out, business is in. All through the 20s, you'll have Republican presidents who partner with business, and these Republican presidents and the Republican Party will be credited with the prosperity of the 20s. I will get rid of the notes there. And, you know, the one nice thing about being credited with the prosperity of the 20s is you get reelected all through the 20s. You probably have guessed what the bad thing about being credited with the prosperity of the 20s is. Once that prosperity ends, so does your credit. So we'll have Republican presidents, and the Republican Party dominates in the 1920s. In the 1930s, the Democrats will dominate. So there you go. And the Democrats will continue to have that issue that they have as a national party during this era, where they dominate in the South with Klan members, racist folks, that kind of stuff, people who want to continue to oppress Black voters. But in the North, their success is really in the cities with immigrants. And when the Klan expands to being anti-immigrant, that creates some weird problems for the Democrats on a national scale. So it's going to be hard for them to pick presidential candidates in the 20s that are popular, because, you know, people in the city are going to vote, especially Democrats, people in the city are going to vote for somebody who's different than people in the country would vote for. I suppose that's still true in some ways. However, we just have so many more people in the cities now that, I don't know, during that time period, there's still enough in both that it made elections close. All right. I'm going to probably stop recording